I paid for my parents to go on a luxury trip, but they chose to take my sister instead. After they left, I canceled all the reservations. I treated my parents to a lavish, one-week trip to Europe with me. When I picked them up to take them to the airport, they informed me that they had elected to travel with my jobless sister instead of me. My mother grinned. Your sister needed some rest, so we decided to take her. I did not say anything. When they arrived in Europe, they were treated to a great surprise. You're late, my mother exclaimed, stepping out onto the porch and lugging her bag behind her. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. It was 6:02 a.m. 2 minutes late, Mom, I replied, attempting a grin. I got out of the car to help with the baggage, but then I noticed my sister, Karen, emerge from the house carrying her own suitcase. My smile froze. What's going on? I inquired, attempting to keep my voice calm. My mother turned to me, her face way too happy for the circumstances. Oh, Sarah, we decided Karen should go instead of you. She's been so stressed lately, and she really needs this trip. My chest tightened. Instead of me, Mom? I've been planning this for years. I paid for everything. She waved her hand dismissively, as if I had simply brought up something unimportant. And we're grateful, sweetheart, but you're always working so hard. You can take another trip later. Karen needs this right now. Karen did not even have the decency to appear guilty. She only smirked and shifted her weight to one hip. Thanks for understanding, sis, she murmured, her voice dripping with phony sincerity. I looked at the two of them, my heart racing in my chest. My father walked out a bit later, avoiding eye contact and handing me his suitcase. This is unbelievable, I exclaimed, my voice shaking. This was supposed to be our trip, something for me to share with you. Well, it still is, my mother replied with a smile. Just with Karen instead. Don't make this a big deal, Sarah. My name is S, and I've been working extra hours for the past 2 years to provide my parents with an unforgettable vacation. Flights, luxury hotels, guided tours. I meticulously organized every detail, down to the last dinner reservation. But as I stood in my parents' driveway, watching my sister enter the rear seat of my car, I realized something I had been ignoring for years. It didn't matter how hard I tried. Karen was always number one in their eyes. I clenched my jaw, biting back the angry retort that was on the tip of my tongue. Instead, I contrived a stiff smile before opening the trunk. Let's get going then, I murmured, my voice flat. If they want to prioritize her over me, that's okay. They may accompany her, but I wasn't about to let them enjoy it. Except for Karen's constant conversation, the drive to the airport was eerily quiet. Oh my gosh, Mom. Did you see that TikTok about Paris? I can't wait to go shopping there. Do you think we'll have time for that? Or will the tours take up the whole day? My hands tightened over the steering wheel as I stared straight ahead, forcing myself not to say anything. My mother giggled quietly. Of course, we'll have time. We'll figure it out when we get there. I bit the inside of my cheeks. When we get there? They didn't appear to notice I wasn't a member of that we anymore. At one point, my father cleared his throat. Thank you for driving us, Sarah. I know this probably feels unusual. I looked at him in the rearview mirror. Unusual? That's an interesting way to put it, Dad. He did not respond. He simply shifted uncomfortably in his seat, maybe wishing he hadn't spoken at all. Karen leaned forward from the back seat, her words harsh. You're not mad, right? I mean, this is really big of you, letting me go. I could never have afforded this on my own. I clenched my mouth and forced a tight smile. Of course, Karen. Enjoy the trip. By the time we arrived at the airport drop-off zone, my patience had worn thin. My mom hugged me as I helped them unload their luggage. Thank you for understanding, dear. This means a lot to us and Karen, my mother explained. I nodded stiffly, sure, Mom. Karen smiled as she wheeled her bag to the entrance. Thanks, Sarah. You're the best. I stood there, watching them disappear into the terminal, my chest tight with anger and hurt. The ride back home was a blur, and I replayed the conversation in my head over and over, each word cutting deeper than the last. This means a lot to Karen. You're not mad, right? You're always working so hard. I parked in my driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Then, without a second thought, I marched into the house, pulled out my laptop, and logged into every travel account I'd used to book the trip. Hotel reservations were canceled, tours were refunded, airline upgrades were denied. When I closed my laptop, a sense of satisfaction settled over me. They could explain themselves to the front desk staff in Paris, and I was done being their doormat. The tightness in my chest began to ease as I stared at the confirmation emails piling up in my inbox. If they wanted to take Karen instead of me, that was fine, but they would not be staying in five-star hotels or taking private tours on my dime. The calls began as soon as their flight landed, and as I unpacked my suitcase, the one I'd packed so meticulously for a trip that was no longer mine, the irony was not lost on me. I hung up my clothes and neatly placed my shoes back on the rack. I groaned, picking up the phone, and glanced at the screen where my mother's name flashed along with multiple missed calls and texts. I unlocked the phone and read through the messages. "Sarah, what's going on? The hotel won't let us check in. The reservation is missing. Call me right away. Sarah, this isn't humorous. Fix it now." I couldn't stop myself from laughing. Did they really expect me to sweep in and save the day after what they had done? The phone rang again, this time with a call from Karen, and I let it ring until she left a voicemail. "Sarah, this is so petty," she said, her voice dripping with entitlement. "We're stuck here because of you. You must contact the hotel immediately and resolve the issue." I rolled my eyes and deleted the voicemail without listening to the rest. I'd been their fixer for years, smoothing over every mistake and picking up the slack, but not anymore. I eventually decided to respond, if only to stop the torrent of calls. My mother's voice hit me like a tidal wave of hatred as soon as I picked up. "Sarah, what have you done? The hotel claims the reservation was canceled, and none of the trips are scheduled anymore." I let her yell for a bit before calmly responding. "I canceled them." After a long, startled silence, she yelled, "Why would you do that?" "Oh, I don't know," I responded, my tone tinged with sarcasm. "Maybe because you chose to accompany Karen on my trip? You're lucky that I drove you to the airport. We thought you'd understand," she snapped. "Understand what?" I inquired, my voice rising. "Those years of saving and preparing were irrelevant because Karen required a break. Did you think my efforts were in vain?" "Guess what, Mom? I don't understand, and I don't want to." I hung up before she could react and switched off my phone, tossing it on the couch. The calm that followed was beautiful, and I felt like I could breathe again. If they wanted to prioritize Karen, fine, but they could work out the rest of the journey without me. The calm lasted barely a day, and the next morning, my phone was humming again with calls and messages, which I initially ignored. I spent the day cleaning the home and catching up on work, but curiosity got the best of me, and by the evening, I had opened my phone and braced myself for the storm of texts from my mother. "Sarah, you've gone too far. Your sister is in tears. Your father is upset, and we can't get into any of the hotels you booked, Karen. You're acting like a child, and I don't see why you're making this such a huge issue. Just repair it already." Finally, from my father, "We need to discuss this. This isn't right." I set the phone down, shaking my head. For years, I'd been the one to fix things, to make sure everyone was comfortable and happy, and now that I'd taken a step back, they didn't know what to do. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table, letting the anger simmer. How dare they expect me to clean up their mess? How dare they act as if I was the one in the wrong? The next call arrived minutes later, and this time, I answered. "Sarah," my mother said before I could respond, "this isn't amusing anymore. We are stranded. Do you know how embarrassing this is?" I took a leisurely sip of tea. "Embarrassing? Do you think this is embarrassing? Try saving for years, organizing every detail, and then being told you aren't even going on the trip you paid for. Stop being dramatic," she said. "Karen needed this more than you, and now she can figure it out," I stated firmly. "You have made your decision, Mom. You wanted to take Karen instead of me. That's great, but don't expect me to pay for her vacation. We're family," she said. "We don't do this to each other." I let out a bitter laugh. "Funny, I was just thinking the same thing." Karen's voice rang out in the background, crying, "Mom, just hang up on her. She's being impossible." That was the last straw. "Enjoy your trip," I said, my tone frigid. "Oh, you can't, because it isn't your trip. That was mine, and now it belongs to nobody. Goodbye." I hung up before she could respond and turned off my phone for the rest of the evening. I felt an odd mix of anger and relief. Angry that they'd put me in this situation, but relief that I'd finally stood up for myself. They could call me dramatic all they wanted, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let them take advantage of me. The following few days were blissfully quiet. With my phone turned off, I finally had space to think clearly, free of the barrage of guilt trips and accusations. I spent my mornings sipping coffee on my back porch, enjoying the calm I'd craved for so long. My afternoons were filled with work and catching up on little projects I'd been putting off, things that reminded me how capable I was when I wasn't bogged down by their endless demands. But on the third day, curiosity got the better of me, and I turned on my phone to find over a dozen voicemails waiting for me. The first few of which were from my mother, who became increasingly upset with each one. "Sarah, you should call me back right now. This has gone too far. I cannot believe you are doing this. You have embarrassed us. We are your parents. How could you treat us like this?" Then followed Karen's messages, full of the same entitled tone she'd always used. "This is so petty, even for you. You are wrecking everything. Just fix it, Sarah." Finally, my father's voice, lower but no less pointed. "Sarah, I don't understand what's happened to you. Call us back so we can work this out." I paused before listening to my mother's final voicemail, which was lengthy and filled with frustration and exhaustion. "Sarah," she said, "we are back at the airport now. The trip is destroyed, and I hope you are satisfied with yourself. Your sister is upset, and your father and I are beyond disappointed. Call us when you're ready to speak." I deleted the voicemails without responding because I wasn't prepared to talk, and I honestly didn't know if I ever would be. This wasn't a one-time error. It was the sum of years of them putting Karen first and expecting me to accept it with a smile. As the hours passed, I reflected on all the times I'd been overlooked or dismissed. Every holiday where Karen's whims dictated the plans. Every family gathering where my accomplishments were treated as afterthoughts. This trip had been the tipping point, but the cracks had been forming for years. Emily arrived abruptly that evening, carrying 2 cups of coffee and an evident air of inquiry. "I heard about what happened," she continued, placing the coffee on the table. "Your mom called me yesterday." Of course, she had. My mother was always adept at enlisting sympathizers to coerce me into obedience. "And?" I inquired, taking a sip. Emily shrugged, a sneaky smile forming on her face. "I told her you were probably busy and would get back to her when you were ready." I laughed and shook my head. "You're the best." "No, you're the best," she continued, her tone becoming more serious. "Because you finally stood up for yourself. I understand how difficult that is, Sarah. Do not let them drag you back down." Her words stayed with me long after she departed. Emily was correct. I'd spent far too long bending over backward to please people who didn't seem to care about my efforts. It was time to halt that cycle once and for all. By the weekend, I had a strange sense of clarity. The anger was still simmering beneath the surface, but it was joined by something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. Freedom from their endless expectations, freedom from being the family's fixer, freedom to finally live on my own terms. But, as expected, the silence did not last long. It was Sunday afternoon when I received a phone call from my father, which I decided to answer. "Sarah," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion, "your mother wanted me to call. She believes you will listen to me." "Go on," I murmured, reclining back in my chair. He sighed. "Look, things have gotten out of hand. Your mother is outraged, Karen is enraged, and everything is simply a mess. But you are better than this." I stiffened, his words eliciting a new wave of rage. "Better than what, Dad? Stand up for myself? I refuse to let you walk all over me again." "That's not what I meant," he answered hurriedly. "It's just that you've always been the sensible one, the one who keeps everything together. This is not like you." I let out a short, bitter laugh. "You're correct. I'm not leaning over backward to clean up your mess, which is unusual for me." He hesitated, and I thought he might finally understand my point of view. But then he replied, "You're punishing the entire family for one decision. Is that actually fair?" "Fair?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You want to talk about fairness? Was it fair that you and Mom thought I wasn't significant enough to join the trip I had planned? Was it right that you replaced me with Karen if I didn't matter?" "That's not what we were trying to do," he added defensively. "We just thought Karen needed it more." "Of course you did," I yelled. "You always believe she requires more attention, more support, more of everything, and I am always asked to make sacrifices for her. Not anymore." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening, and he eventually muttered, "I don't know what you want me to say." "I don't need you to say anything," I said, my voice firm. "I just need you to understand that I'm tired of being an afterthought. From now on, I'll come first. Goodbye, Dad." I ended the call and set the phone down, my hands trembling. For the rest of the day, I allowed myself to feel everything: anger, sadness, relief. It wasn't easy, but it felt like the beginning of something new. I wasn't the family's fixer anymore, and I wasn't going to be. They could figure out how to clean up their own messes. When my parents and Karen returned, I was waiting for them in their driveway, sipping coffee and feeling remarkably calm as I watched their cab arrive. Karen was the first to comment as they came out, dragging their baggage behind them, their expressions filled with tiredness and displeasure. "Well, I hope you're happy, Sarah." I arched an eyebrow and remained sitting on the porch swing. "Happy about what?" "Our trip was a disaster," my mother exclaimed, waving her hand as if to dismiss the whole thing. "We spent the entire week sleeping in dirty hotels and eating bad cuisine since we couldn't afford anything decent. And don't get me started on the tours," Karen interjected, crossing her arms. "Oh, there weren't any. Do you know how embarrassing it was to arrive and be informed there was no reservation?" I took another sip of coffee, allowing their complaints to wash over me. "Sounds rough," I finally responded calmly. "But you wanted to take Karen, remember? I'm sure you guys had a terrific bonding experience." "That's not the point," my mother replied, her voice rising. "You knew we couldn't afford everything you'd planned. You set us up for failure." I stood up and placed my mug on the table beside me. "No, Mom, I didn't set you up for anything. I planned a trip for the three of us, something unique that I had been saving for years. You are the ones who decided to cut me out at the last moment." My father eventually spoke up, his tone calmer but no less accusatory. "You didn't have to cancel everything, Sarah. That was extreme, was it?" I asked, folding my arms. "Why should I have paid for a trip to which I had not even been invited? If Karen needed it so much, you should have organized it yourself. You're lucky I didn't cancel your return flight." Karen rolled her eyes. "You are so dramatic. It's only money, Sarah. And you're so entitled." I shot back, my patience now fraying. "Do you know how much effort and sacrifice went into preparing that trip? Or do you simply believe that things will emerge for you because someone else takes care of them?" They stood there, surprised and silent for a time. "I've spent years being the responsible one," I said, my voice steady but forceful. "The one who fixes things, prepares things, and ensures everything works well. And you've spent just as long taking everything for granted." "That's not fair," my mother began, but I intervened by raising a hand. "No, Mom, what is unfair is the way you treated me. You chose Karen above me, like you usually do, so I decided to stop being your doormat. You did not want me on the trip? Fine, but you don't get to reap the advantages of my hard work without me." I grabbed my bag from the porch swing and turned to leave. "I'm glad you're safe, but don't expect things to return to normal. I'm finished." As I walked to my car, I heard them calling after me, their voices a mix of anger and guilt, but I didn't look back. The drive home from my parents' house felt strangely peaceful. For years, every visit had left me emotionally drained, but this time, I felt lighter. I'd finally said everything I'd been holding in, and for once, I wasn't concerned about their reaction. When I got home, I made a cup of tea and sat on the couch, replaying the confrontation in my head. They'd been so sure I'd fold, that I'd given like always, but watching their stunned faces as I walked away was a reminder of how much I'd changed. It didn't matter if they were angry, hurt, or embarrassed. I was done living my life to meet their expectations. The next day, Emily called me. "How did it go?" she inquired, not bothering with pleasantries. I laughed, leaning back against the kitchen counter. "Just as you'd expect. They're outraged. Karen is pouting, and Mom is probably attempting to guilt me back into line." Emily snorted. "Let her try? You have a backbone now, and I'm here to keep it in place." I smiled, appreciative of her unfailing support. "Thank you, Emily. I mean it. You've been my rock throughout this." "Anytime," she responded, her voice softening. "So, what's next for you now that you're no longer the family fixer?" That question had been swirling in my head since the confrontation. What was next? For years, so much of my energy had been spent attempting to satisfy my family and earn their approval. But now that I'd let go of that burden, the choices felt endless and a little terrifying. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I feel like I get to make the decision, not them, nor anyone else. Just me." "Sounds like the start of something amazing," Emily commented, her voice bright with a smile. Over the next few weeks, I started making small changes that felt big in their own way. I redecorated my living room, swapping out my parents' hand-me-down furniture for pieces that felt uniquely mine. I spent weekends exploring local cafes and parks, things I'd always wanted to do but never made time for. And I started journaling, writing down my thoughts and dreams without filtering them through the lens of what others might think. Each small step felt like I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd lost. Until I sat down one evening and opened the spreadsheet I'd used to plan the trip. The canceled reservations stared back at me, and I didn't feel a pang of regret, but rather a surge of determination. That money had been meant for a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and I wasn't going to let it go to waste. I closed the spreadsheet and opened a new browser tab and typed solo travel ideas. A few weeks after my parents' return, I booked a solo trip to Italy. It wasn't the same itinerary I'd planned for them, and it wasn't about proving a point anymore. This was for me, a chance to celebrate my independence and finally prioritize me. I had never traveled alone before, but as soon as I stepped out of the airport and into the bustling city, I knew I'd made the right decision. I spent my days wandering cobblestone streets, marveling at ancient ruins, and indulging in meals at charming little cafes. There was no schedule, no one else to consider, just me and the freedom to do whatever I wanted. One afternoon, while sitting on the Spanish steps with a gelato in hand, I pulled out the journal I'd brought with me. For years, I'd written about what I wanted to achieve, but those dreams were always wrapped up in making someone else happy. Now, as I wrote, the focus shifted. Learn a new language, start a small business, travel to at least 5 more countries. The list grew, each goal a reflection of the life I wanted to create, not the one I'd been expected to live. On my last night in Florence, I had dinner at a small, family-run restaurant overlooking the Arno River, and as I watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, I felt a deep sense of peace. This trip had been more than just a vacation. It was a turning point. I'd spent so much of my life trying to earn my family's approval, but here, thousands of miles away, I realized something important. I didn't need it. I was enough, just as I was. When I returned home, my parents tried to reach out again, this time with softer tones and carefully worded messages. "Hope you had a nice trip," one text from my mom read. "Maybe we can all talk soon." I stared at the message for a moment before setting my phone down. I wasn't ready to respond, which was fine. This time, it would be on my terms, and I felt proud as I unpacked my luggage and displayed treasures on my shelves. A week after returning from my trip, my mother called, and this time, I answered. "Hi, Sarah," she said, her tone strangely soft. "How was your trip?" "It was amazing," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "That's nice to hear," she replied, hesitating as if to find the proper words. "We've been thinking a lot about what occurred. Perhaps we handled things terribly." The admission astonished me, but I wasn't about to let her off the hook just yet. "Poorly? You unexpectedly replaced me on a trip that I had planned and paid for." "Poorly is an understatement." "I know," she said. "Your dad and we didn't realize how much it would hurt you." "And Karen?" I asked. "Does she feel awful too? Or is she still blaming me for ruining her vacation?" "She's upset," says my mother. "But I think she knows she could have handled things better." I sighed, resting against the counter. "Mom, this wasn't just about the trip. It's been years of putting her first and expecting me to make up the difference. I am not doing it anymore." "I understand," she answered after a time. "We will strive to do better. We do not want to lose you." Her comments struck a chord deep within me, but I learned not to let guilt influence my decisions. "I'm delighted to hear that," I answered, "but it will take more than words to heal this. I want to see actual effort, not just apologies." "You will," she told me. "We'll give you the space you need, but I hope you'll let us back in someday." After the call, I had a combination of emotions, relief that they were finally admitting their behavior and skepticism about whether they'd ever change. But when I sat down with my journal that evening, I understood something important. Whether or not they changed was not my duty. Over the following months, I maintained my strict boundaries, responding to their calls and texts when I felt like it, but not going out of my way to solve things or smooth over tensions. Instead, I focused on creating the life I wanted. I signed up for a photography class, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the time or energy for, joined a local hiking group, and even started planning my next solo trip. Each step felt like regaining another aspect of myself. One day, as I stood on my balcony watching the sunset, I realized how far I'd come. I wasn't the person who went above and beyond for people who didn't respect me. Instead, I was someone who valued herself, established boundaries, and wasn't scared to stand up for what she deserved. I felt completely liberated. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.